Hello, everyone. Hi. So people in the back, if you hear any volume issues, just give me a wave later on. I'll try to stay pretty close to the mic today. Thank you for having me. It's amazing to see so many people here, and it's great to be back in the South, if I do say so. I've lived in Wisconsin for 2 years now, and it's lovely in its own way, but it's really nice down here too. So I'm going to start with a story. 57 years ago, in the fall of 1959, at North Carolina A&T State University, 4 freshmen lived in the same dorm, and they became best friends. Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., David Richmond, and Joseph McNeil. Their nightly study sessions turned into heavy discussions. They often focused in talking about their disillusionment with messages they had been receiving their life growing up, that if they were polite, if they worked hard, if they went to school, the American dream could be theirs. Franklin McCain called it the big lie. Within a few months, these 4 men decided to take action to challenge the daily injustices and indignities that African Americans faced, especially but not exclusively in the South. Staging a sit-in was not a new idea. Activists in other states had used this tactic. There hadn't been much effect or much fanfare. There was no reason to believe that the action they were going to take was going to have a big effect. The afternoon of February 1st, 1960, these 4 young men walked the 1 mile from their campus to downtown Greensboro. They chose Woolworth's Five and Dime store as their target because of its double standard. Its lunch counters in the north were integrated, but in the South served only whites. So African Americans could go in and buy goods, but they couldn't sit at the counter. First, they made a few purchases, toothpaste and a notebook. They approached the lunch counter with their receipts, showing that they were paying customers. They sat down and they ordered coffee. A white waitress told them to leave. A black woman working behind the counter called them troublemakers and pointed them toward the counter where black customers were allowed to stand. They kept sitting. At one point, a white policeman came in, slapping his nightstick in his hand. Another moment came when an elderly white woman got up from her seat, placed one hand on McCain's shoulder and the other on McNeil's. To their surprise, she told them quietly that she was proud of them and that she regretted they hadn't acted even sooner. They sat until closing, and the next day they returned with nearly 24 other students. The numbers grew, and 1,000 students were marching through downtown Greensboro by day 5. Within a few months, sit-ins had spread to more than 50 cities across the South. The Greensboro Woolworths store finally gave in and integrated their lunch counters in July of that year, serving black customers at the counter for the first time. Kind of ironically, their own employees were the first people to be served. All right. So ever since I had worked on my master's thesis, this was when I was in Florida. I actually did my thesis in Valdosta, Georgia. So some of you may be familiar with that city not too far from here. Ever since that project, I had been interested in how white Americans today would remember the racial past in a place like Greensboro where so much had happened. So would they be proud of their city and the role that it played in the civil rights movement? Would they resent it? How would they portray their younger selves who had witnessed the movement as it was happening in their own backyard? So what do we think we know about ordinary white Southerners during this time? I want to highlight the term ordinary here. Most of our images of whites in the midst of the movement show them being either anti-racist allies, as in the photos on the left here, or as counter-protesters to movement actions, as in the images on the right. So what about all of the majority of white Southerners who represent the in-between, the many more people who are going about their lives and not getting involved? So I decided to interview elder white Southerners in Greensboro and ask them how they remembered growing up during Jim Crow segregation and how they experienced the civil rights era and the activism that happened in their city that became very well known around the country. So the broader question for me was, how do ordinary members of dominant groups make sense of themselves as members of a society that clearly favored them in the past, so under segregation, and that has changed over time, including a major movement that critiqued institutional and legal discrimination and their own access to racialized privilege. So I was asking, when elder white Southerners construct narratives of themselves today, what are their storylines? In their stories, who are the protagonists? Who are the antagonists? What are the struggles and triumphs? What storylines are theoretically possible, but which they don't have within them? And which emotions continue to resonate for them when they think about the past? All right, so I'm a sociologist, and I know we have a mixed group here, so I wanted to give just a really quick overview of some of the major perspectives undergirding my approach to this study. So some foundational concepts among sociologists who study race and ethnicity, particularly in the American context, but not exclusively. Racism being a systemic issue, so infused into the institutions of the society, not just a matter of feelings or beliefs that you might hold about others, but operating through laws and practices and through the culture. Another aspect, the notion that race and racism have changed over time. We clearly see that in lots of ways, so through slavery, Reconstruction, segregation, civil rights movement, and now we call ourselves post-civil rights. Not post-racial, right, but post-civil rights era. So nevertheless, throughout this history, there's been quite a lot of continuity in terms of power dynamics and the racial hierarchy. So seeing that sort of through thread of white domination. We think about racial ideologies, how people think and talk about race, how that can justify the practices that are happening throughout the society and help to support racial disparities. Many scholars today talk about colorblindness as the new ideology that has become dominant in the post-civil rights era. So this idea that we no longer have really blatant racism, this idea that discrimination isn't limiting people's chances anymore, that maybe we have some lingering inequalities and maybe people are creating their own disparities through their behavior or their faulty culture. So that's something that we have found with people today in terms of how they think and talk about race. And then, my study is about memory. So how do we think of memory in the social sciences? We view memory as a contemporary process. So it's not a reflection of what happened in the past. Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Not a reflection of what happened in the past, but how people continue to construct what they think happened in the past. So this is a process that is not static, and it's a process that it's deeply contemporary and linked to how people view themselves and the society that they're in. All right. So there have actually been surprisingly few studies of how white Southerners remember the racial past, really just a handful. Many members of the segregation generation are still living today, lots of people. They are our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and they're elders in our communities. So I interviewed, almost 10 years ago now, started my interviews in Greensboro, North Carolina. I interviewed 44 people, and they were all lifelong residents of the Greensboro area. So I wanted them to be old enough to remember segregation, not as a tiny baby, but really as deep into their life as possible, and to have lived in that place so that they could comment on local events as much as possible over a history. So I asked them to talk about just how they experienced things, how they remembered things happening. I used a snowball sampling, so this number 44, I actually would like if it had been bigger. It was hard to find people. So snowball sampling is where you find a few people, word of mouth, and you try to get them to lead you to other people. So I needed people who were of a certain age, willing to talk about race with me, a stranger, and had been lifelong residents of this particular area. And I want to say a bit about myself and who I was doing this research. I was born and raised in the South. Many people say they can't decipher an accent, but I do say y'all a lot. It's one of my favorite words. I grew up in Arkansas, and I identify as white. By the way my interactions went with the people I interviewed, I think they read me as white. Yeah, for the most part, there was kind of some, with many of them, a shared understanding I could tell that we had over being white Southerners to a certain extent. I did have sort of a complex set of interactions with them. Some were kind of wary of me, although most people actually agreed to be interviewed quite readily, and this was just over the phone, cold calling most of them. But most of them said they probably weren't the right people to be interviewed. They didn't have a lot to say, they thought, or maybe I should talk to someone else who knew more. But they wanted to help me. So there was this theme of, wanting to help a young person out with my education, which was nice. And I really did appreciate all of their time. So we had a big generation gap. I was in my mid-20s at the time. So I think a lot of them viewed me as like a grandchild to a certain extent. So in terms of my interview style, it was, I would say, quite deferential to a certain extent. So some people go into an interview maybe guns blazing and want to challenge a lot, and I didn't find that was probably going to be that helpful. So I really just tried to pull out whatever stories they had, whatever memories they had. Okay. So in terms of what I was looking for in my analysis, identifying themes, what were people saying, what were people not saying, how were they saying it, and also emphasizing storytelling, again. All right, so there is a whole book of the project, so I'm picking a small portion of it today to focus on, but I wanted to give you a quick overview of what the rest of the project found. So first of all, I had people talk about segregation era, and I had them talk about the private spaces of segregation, so to a certain extent the white home and white communities, and also the public markers of segregation. So people frequently, when discussing this era, expressed a lot of nostalgia. So they said neighborhoods were safe, people cared for each other in this time. You could ride your bicycle down to the end of the street or across town and it was safe. And nostalgia is what we would expect when you're asking people to talk about their childhoods. But this nostalgia for many of them did extend into racial interactions. So they would say things like, we all got along, we didn't have problems back then, we all respected each other. So they told a lot of stories of employees who worked in their house, so African Americans, nannies or yard workers. A lot of them said they had a family-like relationship with their black employees. They rarely mentioned the racial hierarchy and power differences. And they all said they remember noticing the symbols of segregation, so the signs and the water fountains and being curious about that stuff. They did tend to acknowledge on some level that there was inequality. These acknowledgments tended to be brief and fairly superficial. So they knew black schools maybe didn't have the same resources as white schools had, for example, and they knew that African Americans were excluded from certain spaces. But most of all, they sort of described this time as it was just the way it was. So just the way it was normal, and they didn't really have any judgment for this time. In discussing the civil rights era, there were really two major components of this. So there was the activism that was happening in Greensboro, and then there was school integration. So in the book, these are two separate chapters, but for the most part, people Basically, everyone said they agreed with integration, agreed that the school should be desegregated, agreed that there shouldn't be, lunch counters where only one group can sit. But when they told stories about this time, most of all, they emphasized that whites were in danger, they were victimized, and it was a chaotic time, and it was inconvenient. The protests were kind of troublesome to everyday life, and a lot of the civil rights leaders were portrayed as self-serving and not really seeking justice necessarily. School desegregation, that whole period, there was a lot of resentment that people harbored for that time overall. Really just a handful of people who had good things to say about how integration had happened. Their memories of the era there were quite a few historical inaccuracies, so a lot of people didn't even know like when the protests happened. They couldn't really pinpoint a year, for example. Overall, they downplayed the value of the movement, symbolically distancing themselves from it. So it happened, it was fine, but wasn't really that important. Sit-ins happened, they would say things like, sit-ins happened other places first before they ever happened here, right? Sort of like it shouldn't be any big deal. So today, I did this in bold. This is the part that I'm going to be talking about today. So not the school integration part, but the activism that happened in Greensboro and how they remember that. And then lastly, people, of course, these interviews were 2007, 2009. They talked quite a bit about the current era, contemporary era. And this really was right before Obama got elected. There were just a couple of interviews that came in after that. So the pre-Obama era. So most of all, people felt like an integrated society is good. A lot of them said it was great that their grandchildren could, be colorblind in a way that maybe they didn't experience. Many of them did not approve of interracial relationships, though, just the friendships. Many also felt that a lot of things had been lost. So there was sort of a sense that a lot of things were better in the past than they are today. So values, safety, even black culture. Many felt very negatively about it today and more positively about black culture during segregation, or what they perceived it to have been. And they had a lot of resentment towards any contemporary efforts to address racial injustice from the past. So anything that brought up something negative about the past, they viewed very, very poorly. All right, so thematically, sort of across all of these eras, these reflections of eras, I saw that there was sort of an intellectual agreement with equality, in a sense, and intellectually agreeing that yes, there were bad things that happened. But the most vivid stories they told, the most emotion they let out was really in the realm of characterizing whites as good, racially enlightened, good neighbors, innocent bystanders, and remembering black liberation movements, truth and reconciliation efforts as threatening and troublesome. All right. So also a lack of empathy or even sympathy expressed for anything that African Americans had endured, and emphasizing basically the whites as good theme much more often. Okay, so in this I argue that these constructions, these narratives perform functions for ideology, so supporting historical or contemporary white dominant structures, and perform functions for identity, so bolstering that sense of a moral self. So it's normalizing a white dominant society, presenting Black Americans' freedom movements as problematic, and portraying themselves, their families, and their communities as really never racist, never particularly bigoted, and never involved in racial oppression. Okay, so today I'm going to share some excerpts from my interviews where people talked about the activism that happened in their city. I want to say one more thing about Greensboro. So Greensboro and the state of North Carolina, I don't know if y'all knew this in Georgia, but has had a reputation in the past for being racially progressive. So Greensboro in particular has thought of itself, and when I say Greensboro, I'm talking about white Greensboro historically, thought of itself as very enlightened. So they've had this progressive reputation. Historian William Chafe calls it the progressive mystique of Greensboro. So this idea that we're the most progressive place, but yet in their actual actions and practices, it says something very different. So just one example of this, what happened in Greensboro around school integration. So Brown versus Board of Education decision came out of the Supreme Court in 1954. The Greensboro School Board met really soon after that, like the next day or that evening. They met and they voted to make a public statement. We're going to say we're ready to comply with this decision. So they did that, and they were basically the first school district in the South to do that. But it took them 9 years, so 1963, to implement a freedom of choice plan. So freedom of choice was basically a way to do very minimal integration. A lot of school districts decided to do this. And they held out until a federal suit against them until 1971, and they finally put in a comprehensive integration plan for their schools. So 17 years. But they still portray this positively, this whole process, because they didn't have any violence. So it went down much better here than other places, right? So still sort of holding to that idea of themselves as racially enlightened. All right. Oh, and then also a little more context in terms of when protests were happening in Greensboro. So the February 1st one at the Woolworths, early 1960, that really led to a lot of other protests at other places throughout the city. And the height of it was really 1963. So we're talking here about a 3-year period where the most of this was happening. So thousands of people were eventually arrested in the protests in Greensboro. They're well known as being quite nonviolent, not a lot of heavy police repression, for example, like in some other cities. All right. So just a note about some of the quotes I'm going to be sharing with you, and I will be reading them, and some of my southern accent may come out because I still hear them in my mind when I read their quotes. I will be using pseudonyms, so not the actual people's names. I'm concealing their identities. All right, so there was, with many people, an implicit contrast that they would draw between how nice things were under segregation and then how difficult things were under when the civil rights movement started happening. But there were a few people who drew this conclusion very explicitly. So I'll share with you an example of that. And this is a married couple. So these people both fit the description of the target population I was looking for. So we sat for the interview as the three of us together, and they were upper middle class. All right, so throughout this whole interview, they kept talking about how nice it was during Jim Crow. Everybody got along, everybody was respectful of each other. So they're going to start talking about that and then move into a story. Sorry. All right, so as far as our family was concerned, we were very close to them. We were told you treat them just like you want to be treated. Absolutely, yeah, that's the way we were raised, to treat people how we want them to treat us. So here again, this shows the respect that we had for them and how we've gotten along. So they're really trying to push this point to me. We really did get along. Now, it wasn't all roses. Every now and then there'd be somebody stir up something. Back in, when was it? In the 60s, I guess, when we had most of our race riots here. And most of that, I think, started in the schools and in the universities. I remember one night there was a mob. I don't know how many, but I know the street was full of blacks. And the owner was standing in the door of his cafeteria, and he said he wouldn't let them in. And just as I got outside, down to the corner across the street where I'd parked, they rushed him. And here I am, almost in the middle of this crowd of upset people, and I just got out, and I just kept going. All right, so this was a demonstration at Mayfair Cafeteria. This was a popular restaurant that only allowed whites in. So I want to point out when this account happened in the interview. So this was the early part of the interview, and we were discussing segregation. So when I interviewed them, I tried to sort of do it chronologically. Let's start in your childhood. How was that? And then eventually lead into the later eras. And this was one of the many cases where people would sort of bring in that later stuff, and they brought it in here as an explicit contrast. So he transitions, it wasn't all roses, right? We all get along, but it wasn't all roses. So this could have been a moment, if you can imagine, this could have been a moment where maybe he shared a critique of Jim Crow, right? Instead, he recalls an incident that was caused by protesters that had put him in physical danger, right? So this excerpt also shows a related theme in the narratives. So although he is laughing here while he's telling it, so you can see I've included some of that. He is describing a very volatile situation that was created by a mob, right, in his language, a mob of protesters that he was lucky to have escaped. And a lot of people actually used this language, mob, riot, so he also uses the term riot. These are very loaded terms, right? They're associated with violence, they're associated with unruliness. And these actions in Greensboro were by design nonviolent, right? They were sit-ins, they were picketing, and there were some boycotts. But they were often described in these very sort of heightened, violent terms, and presented as dangerous to just ordinary white people who are going about their daily business. So here we have whites as vulnerable bystanders to who knows what could happen, right, by these volatile aggressors. All right, so a similar story came when I interviewed Trudy. Trudy was a working class woman. This was early in the interview. Again, we were discussing her childhood and discussing segregation. And I asked her, if she had known of, this is my quote, any sort of violence that happened between blacks and whites. So we're talking about her childhood. This is deep in segregation. Any sort of violence. Okay, so what might this cue in her mind? This kind of cue had the potential for people to think about things like white harassment of African Americans, lynchings, things like that. Instead, she recalled how she felt fear as an adult during protests. So this was her response to that, any sort of violence. I had an incident that scared me half to death. It was scaring me when they would lock the doors of my workplace and tell us to go home. I thought, you still putting us in danger because they could still be outside. So then I'm trying to ask her, but basically, was it violent? So have you seen any violence? Well, I can remember going on business errands by myself all the time. But the minute the riot started and everything started being stirred up by the colleges and whatever here, then I could not go alone. I had to have a supervisor or someone go with me, and that used to really scare me. All right, so this was one of many accounts that located racial violence, racial animosity explicitly in the civil rights era and not in what had come before. So again, she uses the riot language, and it was stirred up by the colleges, right? So these students at the colleges and the high school, in fact, there were a lot of high schoolers engaged in activism in Greensboro. So the theme here is palpable fear, right? This is the first thing that she remembers, even after I try to redirect her. Did you ever actually see anything, right? I know you felt fear, but did you see anything? Right. So this perception of the volatile black protester extended even to the most peaceful protest actions. So the next example will come from Nora. She's middle class. She was working downtown. She worked in a local city government building, and this was during the 1960s. So she recalled seeing several incidents, actually, through the course of her work days. But one of them was a march and prayer demonstration. So some students had walked that 1 mile from the black high school and college downtown, and they were having a prayer demonstration. So this one's long. They had a long walk of students, and they came to my building, and they were all knelt down and going to have a prayer for the American people. And I was just having to step around wherever I could to get down between the people. And my coworker said, "How long are they planning to stay here?" And I said, "They'll leave when the pigeons come to roost." Because, we had pigeons by the 100. They'd roost up on the ledge, and about 6 heads popped up, and it was all I could do not to laugh. And my coworker kept saying, be quiet, be quiet. Because he got afraid that one of them would get angry and would get up and start a fight or something. And when I got home, my husband agreed with him. Now that everybody's telling me about how quick I could have set off a fight or an uprising, I said I would not do it again, and I wouldn't. So another example similar to Kenneth's, she's laughing and chuckling, but she's clearly regretting that she made this joke, this wisecrack. And she believes to this day, so this is 50 years later, that these black youth knelt in prayer could have attacked her. And we can also see here some collective thing happening among whites. So these, in this case, 2 white men have helped convince her that she needed to be afraid in this moment. All right, so Nora remembered this moment as a very close call. When I asked her what she thought of it, what did she think they were doing, she added another layer onto her narrative of threat. So she actually believed that the demonstration was meant to taunt white people. So I asked her, what did you think about them doing that? I think that they just wanted to be seen. When they came that day and knelt down as if they were in prayer, I felt like that they were just trying to make a statement to us that one day I may have your job. I don't think that any of them were praying. I don't think it was a thing about Christianity or anything like that. So we already got that layer of physical aggression, but now we have economic threat as well as the other layer. So she's framing in her mind, she's framing a silent protest that it really is kneeling and praying as deeply threatening. And she's constructing, in this case, I think that we have a racial power balance here and age, right? So she's constructing these youth as potential attackers of white adults. All right, so the last quote I'm going to share with you today it's actually milder in tone than some of the others, and it's a little more balanced in its perspective. This one comes from Suzanne. At that time, my mother would take us down to the shop every weekend, and that was just our highlight of the week, to get to go downtown and peanut shops down there and get to go to the luncheon counter, and we felt we were really in the world then. And after that first sit-in, I can remember my mother saying, we aren't going, we can't go anymore. She was fearful of what was going to happen. One of us would get hurt, we would get caught up in something, a fight that would develop, or somebody would lose control and we'd be in their path or something, and we felt fear. And I didn't say blacks didn't feel fear. I think maybe they felt like they had to do what they were doing no matter how they got there. But like I said, it shouldn't have been that way in the first place, but it was. And it did need to change, but I don't think either side should have to fear. So here, Suzanne didn't witness anything firsthand, but she remembers this from her mother. Her mom stops this happy ritual of her childhood. And she recalls that she really did feel fear, right? And her mother helped her to feel that fear that she might be caught up in something. So here we have this sort of disagreement, right, that I was mentioning earlier. It did need to change, right? Segregation needed to change. And she didn't present the protesters as necessarily hostile to whites, right? Something could have happened, and this could have been really from anyone. And she's also acknowledging here African Americans were vulnerable in these spaces as well and in these moments. So this makes her story not nearly as threat-laden as some of the others. However, what I want to highlight here is how she brings up it's unfair that whites were exposed to this kind of danger and worry and anxiety. So it did, this part at the end here, it did need to change, but I don't think either side should have to fear. So drawing this equivalency between the fears that maybe whites were feeling and African Americans' vulnerabilities. So I see this as detracting from white resistance to the movement, right? So in other words, if you have a bunch of nonviolent protests, these are never going to escalate to violence if not for white resistance, right? So sort of saying, we were all in danger is sort of downplaying what whites did to escalate. Right, so we all have stories and narratives of our lives, right? Through our stories, we make sense of the world and we make sense of who we are as well. So part of what we see here is reality projects, people constructing what was and who they were in these spaces. So they're providing commentary on the society and on the self. All right, so overall, people's narratives of the civil rights era constructed whites as threatened and burdened. And this was in contrast with the interracial harmony that they recalled under Jim Crow. So I argue that this ideologically supports systemic institutional white racism in 4 ways. So first, through emphasizing white suffering, they downplay the extent of oppression that African Americans were facing under segregation, right? Sort of skirting that whole issue. Second, by portraying white harm, so harm to whites as beginning when the civil rights movement began, they downgrade the value of the movement and devalue the bravery and the organizing that Black Americans and their allies demonstrated in their activism. Third, by characterizing African American protesters as dangerous, aggressive, and vindictive, they reinforce negative stereotypes about African Americans. And by situating white Southerners as vulnerable to attack, they elevate notions of white innocence and white goodness. All right, so beyond that, I make the case that these storylines enable elder white Southerners to claim a moral identity, right? Positive sense of themselves and their community that spans their entire lifetime. So these narratives allow them to avoid being confronted with racial guilt or the notion that whites were responsible for and invested in Jim Crow psychologically and materially. These stories allow them to avoid characterizing white people or white society as antagonists to the Black freedom movement. So white Southerners, they creatively have authored their civil rights stories, and they are guardians of these stories. And again, this was about 50 years. They're thinking back about 50 years or more. And it does appear that some of their memories have resisted being transformed by broader, now mainstream narratives of the civil rights movement. So particularly, we have a pretty common narrative that civil rights movement was really important for bringing about, a post-racial, equal society. Sort of the narrative that we spin today in the mainstream. All right, and then lastly is the thing I've been thinking more and more about with regard to this. I really think much of this research speaks to whites' emotional connection to race and racial matters, even when they claim that they don't have a racial identity or they don't have many experiences that they feel are racialized. But I think we are actively working to maintain a positive racial identity as whites through how we perceive the racial moments in our lives. All right. So before we move on, I'm hoping that we can have great discussion today. I want you to know that I decided to talk about these particular narratives today for a specific reason. What I hope my research can do on some level is provide insight into how ordinary people, ordinary white Americans, are connected to people of color's liberation efforts, right? Not standing separate from, but involved in, how they have the ability to work toward change across racial lines or to resist that, and how their investment in seeing themselves as good, as well as the society as good, may be one of the deeper motivations for their resistance and their silences and the action that they take or fail to take. So one thing I wanted to ask you regarding this contemporary moment we're in, do you think we might draw parallels between how ordinary white Southerners perceive the civil rights movement and interpretations that we're seeing today of the movement for Black lives? So do we see people devaluing today's activism, distancing themselves from it, emphasizing threat and violence? Do we see that some are motivated to remain ignorant of or confused by racism, racial disparities, to reject protesters' perspectives of reality, their goals, or their strategies? So in the narratives currently being constructed, who are the protagonists? Who are the antagonists? What are they struggling with? What will they triumph over? I always tell my students, because they can be really disillusioned about just being in school. I always tell them, you're living in a historical moment, which isn't very exciting for them. But in the end, I think we are in a really important moment right now. So in the end, how will this movement be remembered differently by different people? We are actively constructing those perspectives right now. All right, so thank you very much.